Good afternoon. My name is Philip Munoz. I'm the director of the Center for Citizenship and Constitutional Government. Thank you. It's my pleasure to welcome you to today's event. The Center aims to explore the fundamental principles and practices of constitutional government. So our Notre Dame students are equipped to protect their God-given natural rights, exercise the responsibility of self-government, and to be the future leaders of our country. In our classes, in our programs, we try to foster the leadership that will actually make our country great. And there's no better way for us to foster that leadership by introducing our nation's future leaders to our current leaders. So Governor, thank you so much for being here with us. Today's lecture is a particularly meaningful one, especially to me personally. This is our 2024 Jeanie Poole O'Shaughnessy Memorial Lecture. Mrs. O'Shaughnessy was a member of the class of 1986. She was a cheerleader when she was a student, as you can see. She loved America, and she loved Notre Dame. Just over 3 years ago, she passed away unexpectedly and quite tragically. Jeannie's husband, Patrick, is here with us today. Some of her family and her closest Notre Dame friends are here too. Patrick, to all the friends and family. Notre Dame is more than just a university. It's a family here. And Patrick, I said this last year too, when you come back, remember that this is always your home. Jeannie's contribution to Notre Dame, to the world, continues through this lecture and all that you're doing. So we grieve with you. We love you. Thank you so much for being here. Let me tell you a little bit about the center. The most visible thing we do is lectures like this, but we do all sorts of other things. And if you want to get on our mailing list, please, you can scan the QR code and you can get on our mailing list and you'll know what we're doing. One of the things we do here at Notre Dame is a few years ago we started our Constitutional Studies minor. We started with 3 students about 10 years ago. We now have 175 kids in the minor. It's one of the largest minors in arts and letters, and a third of our students are from the business school. What we do in that minor is we teach our kids the fundamental principles and practices of the United States of America. We teach them the principles of the founding. We have an undergraduate fellowship. Our Tocqueville Fellows, there's about 24 Tocqueville Fellows. They have to apply to it. One of the things the Tocqueville Fellows get to do is they get to meet our distinguished visitors. So I'm not sure if you know this yet, Governor, but at 7:45 tomorrow morning, you're going to have breakfast with our fellows, and it's a free-flowing conversation. Hopefully, they'll be in a condition to have a seminar. We sponsor research. We have a book series with Notre Dame Press. We bring in visiting scholars. We do all sorts of things. So I invite you to come to our website, constudies.nd.edu, and learn and join us in what we're doing. Next week, we have another terrific lecture. In fact, I just finished the governor's book this morning, and he writes about our speaker for next week, Dr. J. Bhattacharya. Dr. Bhattacharya was one of 3 authors of the Great Barrington Declaration. Governor DeSantis talks about him in his book, and if I remember correctly, the governor said he's one of the scientific voices that he actually listened to and thought got it right during COVID. He's going to give an extraordinarily important lecture on the necessity of free speech and a culture of free speech for science. So I invite you back next week. That's going to be 3 o'clock over in the Carey Auditorium in the library, I believe. Come join us next week. A few thank yous. To my staff, they've been working extraordinarily hard, so thank you to everyone who's working, our student workers, the governor's team. They've been terrific. Notre Dame security, thank you so much. A word about our Q&A and how we're going to do it. Every speaker we bring in, we say it's a condition of speaking for the center, is we got to do Q&A. It's an academic event. to get as many questions as possible in, here's what we're going to do. We're using a technology called Slido. Maybe we can put that one up. And if you scan this, or you can go to slido.com and you put in the number there, you can ask questions. Now, this is a little frustrating for me because I actually ban technology in my classrooms. But this is how you can ask questions, and you can actually vote on the questions that I will ask. Now, you know, since we know we lost democracy, I may or may not. I may or may not ask the questions you vote on, but you can vote on them, and I will correct for punctuation, but then we'll get as many questions as we can. You can also see the questions, so I'm not going to filter your questions or anything like that. So scan that and you can ask your questions. Okay, the governor's lecture today is Conservative Leadership on the Eve of America's Semi-Quincentennial. We have a tradition here at the centers. We invite our undergraduate students not only to meet, to eat, to do a seminar with the governor, but also to introduce our guest speakers. One of my favorite students, Luca Fanucchi. I get that right? Luca Fanucchi is going to introduce the governor. Luca's a senior here, a Tocqueville fellow. Luca, why don't you come and introduce the governor?
Good afternoon. Since 2019, Ron DeSantis has served as the 46th governor of the state of Florida. He was also a candidate for the Republican presidential nomination in the 2024 election. Previously, he served in Congress for 3 terms as the U.S. representative for Florida's 6th district. Prior to his political career, Governor DeSantis served as a federal prosecutor and a JAG officer in the U.S. Navy. During his active duty service, he deployed to Iraq as an advisor to a U.S. Navy SEAL commander. His military decorations include the Bronze Star Medal for Meritorious Service and the Iraq Campaign Medal. A native Floridian, Governor DeSantis graduated with honors from Yale University, where he was the captain of the varsity baseball team. He has also received a JD with honors from Harvard Law School. On a personal note, my grandfather, Ed Fanucchi, passed away 1 week ago today. He and I were very close, and politics was a major interest of ours. In fact, even when I was a little kid, he always pushed me to reason and debate with him through things. One of the last conversations he and I had was about this event with Governor DeSantis. And I can tell you all it brought him so much happiness and pride to know that Governor DeSantis would be speaking here at Notre Dame, and that I'd have the honor of being a part of it. With that being said, please join me in giving a warm welcome to our distinguished guest, Governor Ron DeSantis.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Oh, thanks so much. It's great to be here. It's great to be in South Bend on a football weekend. Thank you, thank you. You know, I committed to come here this summer for this weekend, thinking that tomorrow's game would be a clash of 2 top 10 ranked teams. Florida State didn't exactly keep up their end of the bargain, so I'm looking forward to seeing the game tomorrow and being in my first Notre Dame football game, but I'm definitely anticipating a little waking up the echoes and cheering her name. Now, my first recollection of Notre Dame was 1988. I was about 10 years old. And I was mostly interested in baseball, but I started to watch football. And there was a really, really big game that year that they titled The Catholics versus the Convicts. The University of Miami Hurricanes versus the Notre Dame Fighting Irish. Now, as a 10-year-old kid growing up in Florida, I was rooting for the Convicts. I liked the U, Jimmy Johnson, they had attitude, they wore the fatigues, and they seemed like they couldn't be beat. And at that weekend when that game happened, my grandparents happened to be in town visiting us in Florida, and they told me, you cannot root for Miami. You're Catholic. You have to root for Notre Dame. Now, I think it should just be said, this whole idea of Catholics and convicts, you know, looking back, very, very unfair to turn the game, the Catholics versus the convicts. Not all the players on Notre Dame were Catholic. Come on. Now, what I know about that game was when I was watching it, I've since been able to learn a little bit more, partially because I've developed a friendship with the coach, Lou Holtz. And I think if you remember that game, there was a big melee on the field during the warm-ups. Miami and Notre Dame, when you fight in football, you got pads, it's kind of ridiculous, but they're fighting. And so that settles down, they go back in the locker room, and Coach Holtz is addressing this, and he said, if you do anything but unless you uphold the highest standards of sportsmanship, unless you represent our school in the best possible way, you are not going to see a lick of playing time the rest of this season. You want to go fight after the game in the parking lot for them, that's fine, but you have an afternoon to play and a lifetime to remember this game. But just do me one favor. If you do fight him in the parking lot, save Jimmy Johnson's ass for me. And that was all that needed to be said, and the rest is history, and Notre Dame won the national championship. And I have learned, because I've done events with Coach Holtz, I have very few rules about, anything I ever do with speaking. I will never speak after Coach Lou Holtz, ever. I want to thank Patrick O'Shaughnessy, my friend, for hosting this, and it's really an honor to be able to give this memorial lecture for Jeanie. People will ask me about what does conservatism even mean now? We're almost 250 years in as the country declaring our independence. Is it basically just whatever generates clicks on the internet? Is it whatever gets you the most engagement on social media? Is it what so-called influencers are able to monetize? Is it just a set of certain policy prescriptions that don't change? Is it just taking Ronald Reagan's 1980 platform and just repeating that without any changes many decades later? None of those are how I conceive of what it means to lead as a conservative elected official almost 250 years after America's birthday. For me, conservative leadership is about having a certain foundation that you bring to the job that you are doing. It means that you have a fidelity to the founding principles of this country. Our founding fathers turned a lot of accepted wisdom on its head. Up until the time America was founded, there were people that had freedom. It wasn't that nobody did, but it was ultimately a determination of the king who had freedom. So sometimes people had a lot of freedom, some had little, some had no freedom. But it's not correct to say nobody was free. But what our founding fathers said is, your freedom is not at the courtesy of the state. It is a gift from the Almighty God. Our rights are endowed by our Creator, including the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And they understood how important it was to set that precedent. We also recognize as conservative leaders, like the founding fathers, the flaws that are in human nature. We have a belief in the necessity of having healthy civic institutions. We've had a lot of challenge maintaining the health of a lot of our institutions. And then we have an appreciation for the accumulated wisdom through prior generations. We are not just simply beginning the world anew every time we have an election. But the governing philosophy that you bring is a way to guide you. It's a way to keep on the right path, but it is not an end in and of itself. It is a means to an end. It's a philosophical framework that allows you to better generate good outcomes for the people you represent. My goal as a leader is to preserve a free society in the state that I govern. And I want to ensure that all of my citizens have what Abraham Lincoln called an open field and fair chance to make the most of their God-given talents. Now, this does not mean knee-jerk preservation of the status quo. In fact, given the degradation of so many of our institutions, I often find myself in the role of being a rebel. I'm taking on a failed elite, the consensus that they tried to manufacture, and I'm trying to reorient the institutions in my state, whether it's universities, whether it's our business climate, on a more solid, durable, philosophical foundation. Now, there are certain things that I think you have to do if you want to be an effective leader in this day and age. First of all, you must protect the people you represent from the pathologies of the modern American left. And we saw this during the COVID pandemic when they went absolutely crazy with these public health experts. Jay Bhattacharya was one of very, very few who actually stood up and said the truth. Most of them were doing politics, not evidence-based medicine. And if you want to go back and see that in proof, just remember, they were telling us you were a bad person if you left your house. Then all of a sudden, you had the BLM riots and protests, and hundreds of public health officials wrote a letter saying that while you shouldn't leave your house for normal circumstances, it was consistent with public health to go out and do protesting with many thousands of people. That was a fraud, and we protected Floridians from that. We were not going to let our state descend into some type of Faucian dystopia where people's livelihoods were destroyed and their freedoms were curtailed. We also protect our children from the pathologies of the left, and part of that is taking on teachers' unions and making sure that the interests of students and parents are what is served by our school system. School unions have become nakedly partisan, and they try to use our kids to advance their ideological agenda. They fought me on having kids in school at all during COVID. We beat them. They fought me on universal school choice. We beat them. And to boot, we've now enacted paycheck protection so they cannot do automatic deduction of union dues. And guess what? Most teachers don't want any part of it anymore because now they have a meaningful choice. We've also stood up. We've also protected our kids from indoctrination in the classroom. The goal of our schools is to educate our kids, to empower parents to be involved in our kids' education. It is inappropriate to be teaching a kindergartner that they're born in the wrong body or that their gender is a choice. And when we have big, powerful corporations like Disney, we're willing to stand up, fight them, and defeat them to protect our parents and our kids in the state of Florida. We've also protected our citizens against corporate America run amok. And, it used to be kind of businesses would just pursue the bottom line. They would try to maximize shareholder value. But in more recent years, they've indulged in ideological crusades such as environment social governance, which is an attempt to impose policies on the public without ever subjecting this to an election or to a vote and really going around the Constitution itself. We eliminated all ESG from our big pension fund, and we basically stopped it outright in the state of Florida. We've also protected our citizens from very dangerous ideologies related to crime, particularly those supported by people like George Soros. We had 2 of the prosecutors that he's helped elect in the state of Florida, and I removed both of them from their posts for failing to protect the people that they were elected to serve. And yes, we have challenged elite consensus. One of the things that the left likes to do is cloak their policy preferences as being the result of what experts have to say. And expertise is being misapplied in our society. Of course, I'm not going to substitute myself for the person flying the jet that brought me to South Bend. That is a certain technical expertise that I acknowledge a pilot has that I do not. But it's one thing to acknowledge that. It's another thing to allow experts to try to leverage their expertise and try to present their policy preferences, many of which are highly ideologically charged, as somehow matters of fact rather than mere opinions. And so anytime I hear experts say, I just try to make sure I'm doing the opposite of whatever it is they are saying. Now, because we have worked hard to protect our citizens from the excesses of the left, we now have a situation in the state of Florida. You notice on election night the other day, nobody was worrying about how Florida was going to come out. In fact, the Florida Democratic Party most recently changed its mascot and they chose a very beautiful, nice Florida panther. The only problem is that is an endangered species, but it's telling because that's what they become in the Sunshine State. The second thing you have to do is you have to stand for truth. You have to keep your compass set to true north. Every single day as a leader, most of the stuff that gets spewed out there is just meant to take you off course. It's meant to trip you up. It ultimately doesn't mean anything. It's ultimately not, it's not something that you need to give attention to, but it's hard sometimes to keep focused. But you must remain focused on true north. And part of what goes into that is you cannot simply put your finger in the wind and try to do whatever you think the fleeting passions of the public may want on any given issue. I mean, obviously, you listen to people, you talk to people, you listen to their concerns, but leadership is not about just reading a poll. Leadership is about doing what's right, even when it is not easy. And if I look back at my time as governor, the best decisions that I made, decisions that save lives, decisions that save businesses, that save jobs, that saved education, those decisions at the time were the most unpopular decisions that I've made. I had massive amount of attack from corporate media, from the left, even from people in my own party in the early days of COVID, but I knew people like Bhattacharya. I was reading the data myself, and I was like, you know what, I think it's going to work out in the end because I do think people are going to see that what I'm doing is the right thing. But even if it doesn't, your job as a leader is not to try to protect your own political hide. You got to be willing to do the right thing when it's all on the line, and you got to let the chips fall where they may. Now, this is not necessarily something that's easy to do, particularly in this day and age. We are living in many ways through an age of deceit. The left and its associated media apparatus lie about many important issues day after day after day. Think about all the lies that were told about COVID. Everything that it's too dangerous to have kids in school, to if you put a piece of cloth over your face, you're somehow not going to get infected. Those were not true, and they continue to propagate those statements even when they knew that they weren't true. Think about our southern border. We were told from the White House podium and echoed by legacy media outlets that our southern border was secured under this current administration, and they even tell us that men can get pregnant with a straight face. So this is what it's come to. It's all about furthering a narrative, regardless of the facts, and they're hoping that we don't do anything different. If you look at how society is arranged with a certain elite consensus that tries to get foisted on the public, what is the media's role in that? It's really to further those lies. The media is supposed to speak truth to power, but what our legacy outlets do is they try to protect power from the truth. They did it during COVID, they did it with this administration, and they've done it with so many things over the years. So as a conservative, we're not just standing pat saying this is all good. We're really the rebels. We're the one that's taking on this elite consensus. We are doing what is right, even though it may not be popular with the powers that be. And sometimes there's these debates about what's the difference between populism and conservatism and all this stuff. And some people have very strong opinions on populism. They say, oh, we got to do populism. Some say, oh, you can't, it's bad. To me, it all depends on what the populist impulse is geared towards. Populism was bad in Cuba when Castro took over the country and installed a communist dictatorship. That was bad. Populism, if it's about I'm going to take from you and give to someone else, that's not good. That's not a healthy impulse. But if a populist impulse is we have a discredited, outmoded elite that run this country in so many different ways and lead so many institutions, and we're going to fight back against that, well, sign me up for that impulse, because that's what needs to be done to recapture these institutions and make sure that our society can remain free. Now, one of the things you'll face as a leader is the agenda and the distortions, always trying to sow divisions in the media. And one of the examples I use is Florida. We, from time to time, have hurricanes. And this can be fodder for the media. So we had one a few years ago, 2022, Hurricane Ian. At the end of September, I was running for re-election, so it was a political angle to it. And it was a massive storm, Category 5. Now, we prepare for these, so we had 40,000 utility workers pre-staged. We had Urban Search and Rescue, Coast Guard, everyone we needed there. Storm hits, does huge damage, but then you have millions of people restored in power in a matter of days. You have rescues effectuated. You have food, water, everyone's getting what they need. Heck, we even rebuilt a bridge that got blown out in 3 days when they said it was going to take 6 months. But you had the corporate and legacy media there, and all they were trying to do was to get stories saying this is a Katrina for the state of Florida, and obviously they wanted to weaponize that against me. Well, they didn't get any of that. People were pleased at the response. They were pleased at how quick everything was and how overwhelming it was. And once it became clear a couple days after the storm that they just weren't getting what they were wanting, you couldn't find CNN with a search warrant in the state of Florida. They were gone. But that is what you should expect. Now, part of what you have to understand is it's not enough to just simply say, oh, we're going to keep taxes low and then just kind of get out of the way. Look, I wish it were that simple. If we had healthy institutions across the board, it would be that simple, but it's not. I know we have the Tocqueville Fellows, and de Tocqueville, when he came in the 19th century, he talked about all these intermediary institutions that made America a really strong, free society, and you need those. But what has happened over certainly more recent years, but I would say over the course of many decades, many of our nation's universities, which has come into sharp relief since the October 7th attacks from 2023, focus more on indoctrinating students in a certain ideology than they do teaching them to think for themselves and preparing them to be citizens of our republic. We have bureaucracies, particularly at the federal level, that are totally run amok. Our founding fathers created 3 branches of government in the U.S. Constitution. They did not create a 4th branch of government, an administrative state, which is immune to the outcome of elections and indeed will act to try to kneecap winners of elections that they disagree with. That is a source of power that has gone outside proper constitutional constraints. You see it with our professional organizations, the legal bar. You see it with different business organizations. You see it with medical associations, the American Academy of Pediatrics, some of these groups which will say that these sex reassignment surgeries for minors is somehow medically justified. It is not. That is ideology. That is an agenda. That's evidence that there's a corruption in the profession. You think about corporate America and some of the things they have indulged in that have nothing to do with their core mission, but are causing perversions within our own economy. So you have to be able to navigate that. You have to be able to fight back against that when it's appropriate to try to recapture some of these institutions. And I'll just give one example. In Florida, my view on our state university system is taxpayers fund this university system. They have a right to ensure that the universities are serving a mission that is in the best interest of the state of Florida. It is not acceptable to say you fund the universities and the faculty can do whatever the hell they want. That's not the way it works. So we've ensured accountability. We were the first public university system to eliminate so-called DE&I, which I think may have been well-intended when it was originally designed, but certainly as practice, it's more apt to call it discrimination, exclusion, and indoctrination. And it's an ideology that they're trying to impose on the students. We've also made to now all tenured professors must undergo review every 5 years and can be terminated for poor performance. We now have an ability to bring in professors directly without getting blackballed by the existing faculty because they don't toe the ideological line. And we have a center similar to this called the Hamilton Center at the University of Florida. And we've also transformed one of our small liberal arts colleges, New College, into the Hillsdale College of the South. But these are our universities. We have a right to make sure that they're serving the classical mission of what a university should be. I am not interested in underwriting indoctrination camps, and indeed in the state of Florida, we do not do that. So that's great. But I think maybe the most important, so you have this foundation, you see the world through a certain lens, you understand the proper role of government, you understand what you're trying to do. Ultimately, you must produce results. And you should be judged on whether or not you're producing results. President Coolidge once said that you cannot substitute the power of entertainment for the power of accomplishment when it comes to public affairs. But think about if you were elected to the United States House of Representatives. As was mentioned, I did that for a few terms. I've recovered from that experience entirely. But it's, what are your incentives? Are your incentives to accomplish anything? Are your incentives to build a brand, to get on cable news, to do social media posts? The incentives are all to do things that don't actually lead to any tangible positive results for the people that you represent. But people respond to the results they see. And it's something that when you impact somebody's lives, legacy media can say what they want, your political opponents can say what they want, but they will believe what they are seeing with their own eyes. Just think about the migration that we have seen over the last 4 or 5 years. Massive population losses from places like California, New York, Illinois, gains in places primarily in Florida and Texas and a handful of other states. That didn't just happen out of nowhere. It happened because people were responding to the failures of leftist governance. You saw crime spiral out of control in many of our urban areas, homeless everywhere on the streets in places like California. Those governments were the worst offenders at propagating COVID hysteria and curtailing people's rights. We see how they misuse taxpayer money and have plunged their states deep into debt. We see school systems that have corroded because of political influence and partisanship. Just think about something as simple as building a train track. So high-speed rail, the state of California, so far they've spent $120 billion. I don't think they have a functioning train yet, or certainly not what it was supposed to be. Contrast that with the state of Florida. We have a 170-mile high-speed rail system that was privately funded for $2.5 billion, so a fraction, small fraction of the cost of what you have in California. Heck, just look at what's going on now with the election. If you watched on election night, Florida, within 1 hour of the polls closing, Florida reported 90% of its results, and by midnight, we reported 99% of our election results. In California, they still have 40% of the vote that has not been tabulated, and here we are 3 days after the election. So this is a failure of governance that impacts people's lives and causes them to vote with their feet. Contrast that with delivering results and success. The state of Florida, yes, we're the #1 state for in-migration. Well, it's partially because we're now ranked #1 in education. We're ranked #1 in education freedom, and we have universal school choice, including private scholarships. We're ranked #1 in economy by U.S. News and by CNBC, and since I've been governor in 2019, the state of Florida's economy has grown by 30%, twice as much as the U.S. economy has grown over the similar period of time. When I became governor, if you take all the debt that the state of Florida accumulated from the 1840s to the present, we've now paid off over 36% of our state's total historic debt, and we're now the #1 state for lowest debt per capita of all of the United States. We, of course, have no income tax. In Indiana, you guys should try that sometime. It works out very well. We have low crime, we have law and order culture, great infrastructure, and you never want bad things to happen, but emergencies do happen, and we have by far the top emergency response anywhere in the country. And so what has that meant in terms of people voting with their feet? Not just people that move in, but how they behave at the ballot box. When I got elected governor, tried that. When I got elected in 18, we had 300,000 more registered Democrats than Republicans, and we had never had more registered Republicans in the history of the state of Florida. When I got reelected 2 years ago, we turned that around, and we had 300,000 more registered Republicans than Democrats, and that went from a margin of victory of less than 1% in 2018 to a 20-point margin of victory in 2022. But get this, since that election in November of 22, we've now netted an additional 800,000 Republicans, and we now have 1.1 million more Republicans than Democrats. So we have taken on big fights, and we have delivered big results. And I kind of view it the same way that Newt Rockne viewed the football when he gave the pep speech talking about we're going to get them on the run, we're going to keep them on the run, and we're not going to stop until we get over the goal line. That's exactly what we've done in taking on the left and beating the Democratic Party and making Florida a place that people want to move to. Final thing I'll say is, you should have a sense of purpose as a leader. You have an opportunity to make a difference in people's lives. And I've seen it over and over again in the state of Florida. I think back to Coach Holtz when he became a coach here at Notre Dame. He was looking through the history. He saw this picture that they used to have up, and he liked it. And he's like, I want you to get that, and I want you to put that in the tunnel. And that sign says, play like a champion today. And you hit that sign as you go out onto the field. Every day you get up and have an opportunity to make a difference. You got to play like a champion. And when you do that and when you produce results, the people, man, they'll walk over broken glass barefoot to support you. Thank you all. God bless you. Thank you.
Thank you, Governor. Let me ask the first question as we load all the questions up. What surprised you most about Tuesday's results?
Well, I mean, I would just say, if you remember the midterm election 2 years ago, Florida, we had this big red wave, right? And it was like just crushing. And I was like, inflation's 9%, Biden's unpopular, like this should happen all over the country. And it didn't. And so I was concerned coming in this election, okay, if a president that's that unpopular has the border open, has us floundering overseas, inflation, interest rates, all these problems, if they're not going to get penalized for that, then do these results even matter? And so I think what the election showed was people rejected the Biden-Harris agenda because they didn't produce good results for those folks. I mean, you look at some of the elections where more Republicans in like the Bronx than had done 4 years ago, certainly way more than 8 years ago. And I don't think that's because of like slick campaigning or media. I think it's just because people saw and they didn't like what was being presented to them. And so they wanted a change. So I think it would have been really, really problematic if you could have an incumbent administration reelected with a record like they have. The reality is, and the media would always say, the economy's so good, the economy's so good. Look, part of the reason the jobs, whatever jobs were created, if you take Florida and Texas out, it would be hardly any job. I mean, we were generating the jobs in spite of them, not because of them. But when people see their costs going up, to just tell them that they should be happy with everything instead of doing some introspection and saying, and when Harris was asked, what would you have done different? Oh, I can't think of anything. Really? You're the change agent and you can't think of what you would have done differently? Couldn't you have said, in hindsight, we spent and borrowed too much money and that has driven inflation up and that's hurt people and we're going to tackle that. They can't bring themselves to say that. They can't admit they were wrong. Could you not have said, it was not well handled that we lost 13 American service members in Afghanistan and left massive amounts of military equipment for the Taliban to take. Like in hindsight, we should have done that better, and yet they didn't do it. So I think voters said, This isn't working. 75% of the country thought we were on the wrong track. Under those circumstances, an incumbent administration should have no chance to get reelected.
Okay. This is a question from Elizabeth Heston. And if you say who you are, and when you write, I can recognize who you are, student or alumni. She writes, congrats on Prop 4. Given that the majority of Americans are in some sense pro-choice, how can Republicans win on pro-life? And let me add to that, so great victory, pro-life victory in Florida.
Yeah. Well, one, I think if you look at the election, there were a number of very, very extreme pro-abortion initiatives that failed. It wasn't just Florida, South Dakota, Nebraska. I think those three. But up until that point, none had ever failed. And so we were able to blunt. And then I think if you look at the election in terms of the candidates, abortion was the dog that didn't bark. I mean, it did not cost Republicans any elections. I can tell you in the state of Florida, we expanded our supermajority in the State House of Representatives. And you'll hear, people will attack, our pro-life legislation as being somehow so extreme, and yet the reality is the voters could have penalized those legislators for that, and they decided to re-elect all of them and even turn out a couple Democrats. And I don't think if you look at President Trump's performance or any of these others, and that was like the #1 issue that they ran against. Now, at the same time, I mean, it's a contentious issue. And I think you got to approach it in a way that's showing compassion for people. We have people that are in very difficult circumstances. A lot of times they don't get a lot of help. We've really worked hard in Florida to provide a lot of resources, and not just with money, but with harnessing our faith-based institutions. I mean, my wife who's here has led a program called Hope Florida, which has helped a lot of very vulnerable single moms. And so you have to do that. But at the same time, what the left does is the left lies about what's at issue. So for example, in Florida, Florida's law is abortion's available until the unborn child has a detectable heartbeat, and there are exceptions for rape, incest, life, health of the mother, and victims of human trafficking, and there would never be any limitation on medical care for things like ectopic pregnancies and for miscarriages. And so that's the law. Now, you don't have to like that. You can argue against that. They spent $100 million basically saying all the things I just told you that weren't in the law were in the law. They were running the same playbook that they've run in other states, which maybe those laws were flawed. I think they're probably lying about those too, but they were just outright lying about what was in Florida law. That is not an issue that the media is going to ever police in our favor. I mean, they are going to continue that because they wanted this, they wanted the amendment to pass. And so there is so much to see. And I was shocked because I'm like, okay, the legislature did basically a compromise. I mean, because there's a lot of pro-lifers that didn't like some of that. And they did basically a compromise. They understood there's some issues that are really, really difficult situations, and a lot of voters have very strong feelings about that. And so they provided that. And yet they argued, every ad was basically saying that those exceptions didn't exist, or somehow doctors were not allowed to provide medical care if somebody was having, which is outrageous, and it was false. And I think we've shown a light on enough voters, but even with that, I mean, when you're going up against $100 million and the corporate press, there's a lot of voters that believe that. And it was really, I mean, I want to have good, honest discussions. It's an important issue. There's a lot of different issues that are important. We should be able to debate these honestly. It was not an honest debate. It was lie after lie. And look, in politics, there's like normal lies, like, you vote for like a tax reform and it like cuts an income tax but maybe raises another tax, and they said you raise taxes even though maybe there was a net tax cut. They're not going to tell you that you also cut taxes in that, and you expect that, right? They're going to highlight the negative. But these were just bold-faced lies that were lying about what the law was in the state of Florida, and they weren't successful on that. We were also able to defeat a really crazy proposal that would have created this like corporate marijuana cartel in our Constitution, and that was bankrolled by one company spending $141 million to try to create a system where you wouldn't be able to grow your own in your backyard. You could only buy it from them, and they would be shielded from all civil liability. The idea of marijuana is pretty popular in Florida, but again, I don't just stick my finger in the wind. I got to say, I was Florida born, Florida bred, and I'll be Florida dead someday. I want the state to do well. If this is something that would be bad for the state, I have a responsibility as a leader to step up and to expose. And I think once people started to see who was behind it, how they were trying to manipulate our Constitution to enrich themselves, even people that were indifferent about marijuana or even had positive views were like, no, we're not going to do it. So that fell far, far short, and that's a lot of money that was lit on fire when it didn't need to be.
Can I do my own follow-up on this? 57% voted in favor of increased abortion rights. Does that number, it lost, you had to get 60% to pass, but does that 57%, how do you process that? Does that concern you? What do you think about that?
Well, so in Florida, we have a system where they're called citizens initiatives, but it's not done at grassroots. These are entrenched interests. So they spent $120 million, including a lot of foreign money, from the 1630 fund, which is funded by a Swiss billionaire. And so they put $14 million from that, massive amounts of money. The industry would make a lot of money off this, obviously, so they did that. And so you have $120 million versus maybe like $15 million on the other side, and then they get to write the language. So the language was written in a way, when we first started testing it with voters, pro-lifers thought it was pro-life. Because of the way it was very deceptive. They didn't define any of the terms. And so, if you have $120 million to spend, you get to write your own language that is that deceptive. If you can't get over 50%, that is absolute malpractice. Because, I can do a poll, and the way you word the question, I could swing the results 20 or 30 points one way. And so what we found is when voters were exposed to what was actually it meant, the support went down. But there's a lot of vote. It's hard to reach people because media is so fragmented and they were spending so much money. So I think the fact that it failed by, I think, hundreds of thousands of votes, given how much money they put into it, given how much positive media they got, that's a huge, huge failure. And I don't think it's a good way to do business when we can't even agree on what we're voting on. And the Founding Fathers, they didn't want to decide issues on just one plebiscite vote. They thought that you had to have representation to what Madison said, refine and enlarge the public view. You got to debate these things. There are all kinds of things that are there. And like the marijuana was an example too. I had people that sent in their mail ballot 6 weeks before the election. I started hitting the circuit talking about it. They're like, can I get my vote back? I didn't know that was in there. Well, then why did you vote for it if you didn't know it was in there? And so, you end up with this situation where it's one thing to have something on the ballot which just says, you shall need 2/3 to raise taxes in both houses of the legislature. You like that? I do. Maybe you don't. But we all could agree what that is. When you do these deceptive and vague and undefined amendments, we're not agreeing one way or another. Even if it passed, there would be people who a year later, I didn't know it did that. I didn't know it did that. So I think part of the way Florida does it is not a good way to do it. Oh, by the way, a lot of the petitions they got signed to qualify on the ballot were fraudulent. There's a massive investigation that's going on, and they're going to find so much more. And that is not the way to do business. That is not the way that you govern. And so, look, when you're running a campaign, you're never saying anything that your amendment actually does. All you're doing is telling demonstrable lies about Florida law. That is not an honorable way to conduct business.
Okay, this is a question from Patrick O'Shaughnessy, and having a 12-year-old, I'm interested in this one in a personal way. You have championed school choice, but also restricted access to social media for teens. How do you decide which decisions should be made by parents and which should be made by the state?
That's a good question. So, obviously school choice, we believe in parents making decisions regardless of income to be able to get the best education possible. We do not limit our school choice program by income. So we started off, when I became governor, it was for basically poor kids, which is appropriate, but we understood that you got to do more than that, and we want the money to follow the student. Just as a philosophical matter, our public schools have gotten a lot better because they compete for students. Our charter schools are top of the heap nationally, and of course we've got some good private schools, so we do that. Now, on the social media, it is currently it really doesn't apply to parents or kids directly. What it applies to is the social media company. So federal law says they cannot issue a social media account to somebody that is 13 or under. That's just not enforced. They are issued to very young kids. And so what we said was, okay, we're going to enforce that. In fact, we're going to do 14. So 14 and under, the social media companies cannot issue an account to those students. 15 and 16, if the parent consents, then the child can get their own account. Now, if a parent wants to give their kid who's 12 or 13 their own let them use the parent's social media account, we're not policing that. We're basically just holding the social media companies accountable. Now, that law has not gone into effect yet. That's going to go into effect January 1st. You know, big tech has a cartel that kind of sues on all this, so they're suing us. We're going to work on ways to get a quick resolution. I mean, they all go to the same judge in Tallahassee that rules against us every time. Media makes it front page news when that happens, and then when it gets reversed on appeal, it's like, you know, never reported that he got reversed, even though that's what happened. So I think you'll see that. But I think we struck an appropriate balance because a parent is able to tell the kid, no, you're too young, you got to get older, and then once you're 15, 16, well, you know, I'm not sure, well, maybe I'll do it under these conditions or whatnot. Then once they're 17, 18, we figure, you know, there's not. So social media has been very, very harmful for young people. That's just a fact. And I think that we want to get kids off of that as much as possible, but I'm not going to go in and police what a parent is giving their kid. If a parent wants to loan them a social media account, they could do it in the state of Florida. If they think it's something that's important, they can, but we're not going to let the social media companies get away with basically violating federal law, which is not enforced, by issuing accounts directly to very young kids.
Question by Danny Botek, starting center fielder on my City League softball team. With the current federal debt greater than $35 trillion and government spending 23% on interest alone, how would you handle the spiraling debt problem?
Well, I can tell you how we handled it in Florida. I mean, I mentioned, you know, we've paid off 36% of our state's historical debt. We didn't necessarily have an obnoxious debt when I came in, but you know, we've taken 36% out. We'll be able to have paid off half of the total debt from 1840s till 2019 just in my tenure as governor. And part of the reason we were able to do that is because I have something that, as governor, that the president does not have, and that's line item veto authority. So they can put a budget on my desk that would be, I think our budget's $115 billion, which, to put that in perspective, we've got 4 million more people than New York, and that budget is less than half of the state of New York's budget. And yet, when people move from New York, they say, you guys have better roads, you have better services, you have better education, so where's all that money going? But I vetoed billions and billions of dollars in spending. The record for vetoes when I became governor was $800 million. In one budget that a governor did. I think that was Governor Bush. I reset that record at $3.3 billion. So that was 3% of the budget we vetoed one year because I understood. We've tripled the rainy day fund. We have a massive budget surplus. We've paid down debt. We've cut taxes. We very easily, because of Florida, our revenues have boomed because of the influx. We could just spend and spend and spend. And there's a lot of things that I vetoed that are not bad. They're not necessarily inappropriate for government, things that you actually could do, probably would have some benefit. But I got to make decisions about what are we going to do to make sure that we're doing things now, but also we're very fiscally sound in the long haul. We have, I think we're number 9 in terms of the health of our state pension fund. So we're about, you know, 200 billion, 180, 200 billion, depending on the market. But what I did was every year we've reduced the assumptions on return. So if I had not done that, we probably would be like in the top 3, right? But we reduce it to be as conservative as possible on that. So like in Illinois, they have very liberal estimates and they're still insolvent. Florida, we're the opposite. We're constantly making it so that we're doing that. So we just, but you have to make tough decisions. People aren't always happy with you when you use the veto pen, but you got to be willing to do that. And I don't know that there's been a spending bill that's been vetoed in Washington for decades. And when they throw these massive omnibus bills and they kind of constantly increase spending, it's very, very harmful. So, we laid out kind of, how I would approach that last year when I was running, but it involves, there will be conflict. There will be conflict with the Congress. There'll be conflict with the media. There'll be a lot of people that say a lot of bad things about you, and it's always easier to just pass the buck. But if you think about it, at the turn of the century, the debt for the United States from 1789 until 2000 was $5.4 trillion. And so from 2000 to the present, we've added $30 trillion in a quarter of a century. So you had 200 years plus to 5.4 trillion, and then you've had since then that. Why has that happened? Well, part of it is the way Washington does. An agency spends 50 billion, next year they automatically get 53 billion, right? I would do zero base. Like, you spend 50, okay, why do you get $1 next time? You got to justify that, right? But it was also the way that the Afghanistan and Iraq wars dragged on. Well, the fact that we did the Iraq war at all, obviously, was and I served in that war, but I mean, wasn't exactly a great outcome in the end for us, and we still have a lot of stuff going on in that region. Iran has been more powerful over Iraq than they were prior to that. Afghanistan, we got out very poorly, but we were there for a long time, spent a lot of money. The response to COVID was probably some of the most serious fiscal mistakes this country has ever made. The inflation that we have seen started with COVID. Now, we had no inflation in 2020, but those policies where the supply chains were disrupted, lockdowns occurred, 2.2 trillion, I think, was the first CARES Act. Second CARES Act, December of 2020, was another 2.2 trillion. Biden's stimulus was 1.9 trillion. Then he did the infrastructure. I mean, you can't just crank the printing presses and spend without there being somebody to eventually pay the bill. So when the inflationary actions are taken, just read your Milton Friedman. It usually takes about 18 to 20 months before you start to see that manifest in the economy. But make no mistake about it, the inflation we've experienced, the interest rates, all of that was driven by bad government spending and borrowing policy, as well as inflationary policies of the Federal Reserve. So, sometimes things happen. Like, we had to fight World War II. We went deep into debt for that, and then we got out of it. This was, I think, a blunder, and especially with Biden, because there's a lot of things you kind of didn't know initially with COVID. I think a lot of these politicians use COVID as an excuse to spend money they wanted to spend anyways. But nevertheless, by the time we got into the spring of 2021, they called it the American Rescue Plan. I can tell you, Florida didn't need rescuing. We were booming. We were doing well. But that's because, we said people have a right to work, business have a right to open, government doesn't have a right to force you to muzzle yourself, all these things that are just basic, but that was not how some of the other states were done. So we've just made a lot of big-time fiscal mistakes. You're looking at a Congress that is likely going to have 53 Republicans. And oh, by the way, I think if you look in the last 25 years, all unified Republican government, I think, has led to more debt than divided government. And I just I'm not here to bash Republicans, but the Democrats don't care about the debt or spending. They don't even pretend that they care about it. And I disagree with that, and I think their policies have been harmful. But the Republicans all claim that they're going to limit spending and that they're going to be fiscally responsible. But when they get power, they just don't do that. And so you're going to have 53 Republican senators. You may not have a Republican House. I think 90% yes, but they're still counting votes in California. I mean, who knows what's going to happen in the next 2 weeks? I mean, it's a rotten system. So you will have, most likely, somewhere, 218's the majority. You'll probably have 220, 221 Republicans. I think it's going to be really, really difficult. I mean, I think that's a high wire act. The prospects of there being meaningful budget reform, let's just put it this way, if you're betting on that, I would take the under on the prospects on that. I mean, I think there'll be a lot of good things that'll be done with executive orders, with President Trump. I think there may be some things they can get through the Congress. But spending reduction, I don't know. Look, Elon Musk says he's going to cut all this out, and I think he's a smart guy, and hopefully they do restrain spending, because ultimately, if you want to stop having an inflationary economy, you can't spend so much, right? So we'll see what happens, but my sense is that the majority is so thin that the Democrats are just going to say no to everything, I think. They're just going to hunker down. And I think it's going to be very difficult to get anything done.
Okay. We have about 15 minutes left, and the questions are pouring in, so we're going to try to go
Sure.
as fast as we can here. I have two questions from different students, but they're questions that ask you to talk to students directly. The first is from one of our fellows, Michael Kennedy. He says, today there's a student protest going on right now, and he's quoting from them. They say you're anti-democracy, anti-LGBTQ, restrictive of voting rights and immigration, anti-Palestine. How would you respond to those students out there protesting? And then let me get a second question in for a different student who writes, and I'm paraphrasing here since it's not in front of me. Some of my conservative friends were not sure they should come to this lecture because they're afraid of being viewed as conservative on campus. What would you say to them?
Great question. So on the protesters, you know, honestly, what I would tell them is get some new material. Those are... I mean, these are just left-wing cliches, like anti-democracy. I mean, what does that even mean? You know, so it's just ridiculous. But let's just take, because, you know, we had the big October 7th incidents on campuses at, like, Columbia and all those other things. And, you know, people sometimes ask me, well, why did that not happen in Florida? And I said, well, it didn't happen in Florida because if any of our universities turned into Columbia, the university president would lose their job the next day. It would be done. We would not ever tolerate the inmates running the asylum. But one of the things that irks me about that is it's not just, yes, this is bad behavior, it's totally fine for them what they're doing, you know, targeting Jewish students, but the cliches that they use betray their ignorance. So, for example, if you're saying end the occupation, well, Gaza is not occupied by Israel. Israel pulled out of there in 2006. So Gaza, the people in Gaza, the Arabs down there, they had free reign to try to make something of that area. And it's beautiful coastline, right on the Mediterranean Sea. What decision did they make? Did they try to make a good life for their constituents? No, they elected Hamas to run the Gaza Strip. Why? Because they wanted Hamas to launch attacks against Israel. You hear about occupation generally. There has never been a Palestinian Arab state. In fact, you go back, just look at the history. First of all, open up a Bible, thousands and thousands of years of connection between the Jewish people and the land of Israel. And if you've been there, you can walk it and you can see it. It's there. I've done it. And then what happened more recently? Well, after World War I, you had a British mandate, British mandate for Palestine. Before that, for hundreds of years, it was controlled by Turks, the Ottoman Empire. No Palestinian Arab state existed there. So then what happens at the end of the British mandate? They say, okay, let's do a Jewish state and an Arab state. And so that was the UN partition plan. Israel, and it was a squiggly little Israel. I mean, it was not a very generous partition for them, but they accepted it, and they declared independence. Did the Palestinian Arabs accept the Arab state that they were given? No. They went to war to try to annihilate the Jewish state. They lost. Then they tried to launch an attack that Israel preempted in 1967 in the Six-Day War, and they lost. Then they launched an attack in 1973 in the Yom Kippur War, and they lost. Then they've done a series of intifadas year after year in the 80s and 90s. They had this Oslo Accords, and that has been a total failure. And then now you have more recently Hamas butchering people. I mean, putting elderly people in ovens, raping women, beheading children. That's what they were doing. So there was never been a Palestinian Arab state. They've rejected a state time and time again. They've lost wars as a result of it. And, you know, my view is like, okay, well, why do they get all these mulligans? How come they never have to accept any type of compromise? And the reason is they are taught from a very young age, not that they want to be an independent state. Their goal is to eliminate the Jewish state. That is what they're trying to do. And so if you find yourself out there saying somehow end occupation, I would just like to know, when there was some type of Palestinian. So I think it's all people that don't know their history. I think it's kind of like the left-wing cause du jour, so they do it. And I'm sorry, this is with the election. There's a little bit of poetic justice. So Biden and Harris, by definition, they got so skittish on supporting Israel because you had an uprising and a revolt in Michigan amongst a lot of the Muslim American voters. And so they were trying to kind of pacify and telling Israel, end it, you got to stop, and not giving Israel the full support that I think they deserved. And so Harris is running as more dovish on that, doesn't like Netanyahu, all this other stuff. Then you got Trump, who wanted the so-called Muslim ban when he was president and said basically Israel needs to just finish the job. And he beat her with the same Muslim voters in Michigan. I mean, so they totally screwed. So I think that all this stuff is just typical cliche, but that's why I think having something like this is important, because a lot of these college campuses, those types of students are never challenged on their assumptions. And so they come out without questioning. If you're a conservative, I guess I can address from the conservative perspective, you always have your assumptions challenged. You learn how to make arguments. You learn how to marshal evidence. You learn these things because no one on a university campus is just going to accept conservative assumptions about any of these issues without putting up a fight. And so one of the reasons why I think it's important to do what we're doing in Florida to foster a situation where you can have free debate is because I want all of our students to have their assumptions questioned. We launched a debate initiative in our high schools. Now it's like a huge thing. We do the national championship in Florida. But what the students will tell you, and I believe, you learn the most when you're given a topic and you have to argue on the side that you actually disagree with. So maybe you're somebody that is really in favor of restricting Second Amendment rights. Well, maybe you got to argue for the Second Amendment, and maybe you get out of your comfort zone and you're able to do that. Academia in so many parts of this country has just totally lost its way. They have been focused more on creating a unified ideology rather than have it really be a free exchange of ideas. But what I would tell a student is, ultimately, if you believe in the principles that made this country great, if you think we've gone off course in many different respects over your lifetime, and you want to see things improve and get better, that is not cost-free. And it may be a guy like me that's governor, and I roll out of bed every morning, and the left and the media have a spasm. I mean, that just goes with the territory. They're constantly shooting at you. That's fine. That's fine. I'm totally willing to. I don't care. I mean, people can say what they want, right? But, not everyone is cut out for that. So maybe you're not going to feel comfortable if you're making arguments that some of the more liberal faculty and students would reject. But, the only way for bad to triumph is for good people to do nothing. So you got to be willing to have some courage, be willing to speak the truth, and to just let the chips fall where they may. But no one should tell you it'll be cost-free. There may be some costs. Unfortunately, it's like, look, my view on it, I don't take any of this stuff personally. I've got friends who have different political views, but there are some people, and I think it's way more on the left than vice versa, like they will disown you if you're supporting conservative causes or conservative candidates. That is not healthy for this society. Part of the reason I would say is, the left has as they become wholly secular, which is their right to do, but I think the leftism has become the fighting faith. It's substituted for what religion used to be for the society. So for me, I've got my faith in God. I understand, that we may, be in this world, but we're not of this world. The politics is stuff that just happens, and you deal with it. But I do not take it personally. And if I have a friend that sees things a different way, they're still going to be my friend. But we don't have enough of this in this country, and I think it's really dangerous.
I'm going to encourage you to keep your answer short so we can get as many as possible. Anonymous question. Florida has experienced the effects of extreme weather, perhaps more than any other place in the country. Why is climate change not a bipartisan issue?
Because what the left is doing is they have an ideological agenda that they try to shoehorn under the auspices of climate change. And so we had a period in Florida, 2006 to 16, we had 0 hurricanes. They said that was because of climate change. Now we've had hurricanes more recently. They said that's because. So it's not falsifiable. Whatever happens, they say it's that. But what do they do policy-wise? Because all I have to say is, okay, if we implemented these policies, what would the impact be? It would be devastating to our way of life. It would be devastating to poor people. It would be devastating to our economy. And Florida, we don't have climate ideology in our policies. Our policy is energy needs to be affordable and reliable. And oh, by the way, in the last 25 years, we've dramatically reduced our carbon emissions through innovation and through market forces. But what they'll do is anytime there's a storm, they will try to politicize it. So they were trying to say with Hurricane Milton, which was a serious hurricane, we've never seen anything like this. That is just factually false, okay? The most powerful hurricane to hit the state of Florida was Labor Day of 1935. We've never had one even approach the severity of the Labor Day hurricane. The most deadly hurricane in Florida history, Okeechobee, 1928, killed 4,000 people. Fortunately, we've never had one that's come even close to that in recent years. If you look at the number of storms since 1851, there's not a dramatic increase or decrease. There's not a dramatic increase in intensity. And I was making this point. It's interesting, like these hurricanes happen. I get these foreign journalists that parachute into Florida, and this is all they care about, right? Because it's become a religion. And I recoil when people are pushing ideology on me rather than things that are evidence-based. But they were asking me all these questions saying, well, there was a tornado here. That's got to be climate change. I'm like, really? Tornado? I mean, we've had tornadoes get spun off of every single hurricane, you know, but they're trying to create a narrative that somehow this is something that's never happened before. There's nothing new under the sun. We've experienced in Florida since I've been governor, I can point to the 1940s where we had a series. I can point to some in the 1870s. So I make these points. The media tries, the fact-checking is basically like if you dissent from liberal orthodoxy, they saying what you're saying is false. So they basically said, oh, well, the governor claims that they're not more severe than they were. And then basically a lot of people wrote in saying, no, he was right, because that's what the data says. And so what they amended it and they said, well, it is remaining powerful for longer when it's in the ocean than it used. Well, I never made any claim to the contrary because, quite frankly, I don't think we could even measure that back then. But what is the policy that you're doing? And you want to kneecap our economy, restrict people's freedoms, but you're going to let China continue to build coal plants? Just look at the difference in emissions between the U.S. and China. I mean, it's ridiculous that they're trying to do this.
Okay, we're going to squeeze 3 in really quick. Okay. So this is from Joey Van Boxtel. He's a former student graduate who clearly wants me to go back and change his grade. What is your favorite essay from the Federalist Papers?
Oh, it's a great question. I would probably say 51. So for those of you who've studied it, that's Madison basically writing about checks and balances and the separation of powers. And if you remember, Justice Scalia used to always say this, that the Bill of Rights is not the primary protector of individual liberty in the Constitution. In fact, the original Constitution didn't have a Bill of Rights. They added it in the first Congress because by laying out power, dispersing it amongst 3 branches, provide the ability for what they said, ambition to counteract ambition, you make it so it's hard to have a major locus of power without any checks, and then individual liberty is preserved as a result of that. One of the reasons I think the administrative state is such a threat is because it's basically a massive locus of power that has become immune to traditional constitutional checks and balances. But if you want to know how the founders understood human nature, political power, and incentives, read 51.
Okay, that was pretty good, though the correct answer was Federalist 49. All right. This is the question that people want. Have you been offered? And if so, would you take a position in the Trump administration?
So look, I mean, I think he's got a lot of great people to choose from. I think he's been around the track once. I think he's thought a lot about, how to approach it this time. I think he'll end up, hopefully, with a lot of really great people. I mean, I think for me, I'm not seeking anything. I've got a great job in the state of Florida, and the way I view it is. The way I do it is, I do this because I want to make an impact. I want to make a difference. If I see something that needs corrected, I want to have the ability to go in and do it. And we've done that. And so how can I best make a difference? I think, given where we are, I think me quarterbacking the Sunshine State is probably how I make the biggest difference. And, we've got, I've got my 6-year-old here, first grader, Mason, and his sisters didn't want to come on the trip. They said it was too cold to come to Indiana in November. But, he's a diehard Florida State fan, and he needs a few more football seasons under his belt.
All right, one more question, but before I do that, I want to recognize the First Lady, Casey. Thank you for joining us so much. Yeah. Now, I need to preface this. I want you to remember that one of the points of your lecture today was you always have to tell the truth. Give us a score for tomorrow's game.
So listen, I call them like I see them. It's a little easier for me. I don't have any allegiances in the Florida football. Like I mentioned, I played baseball at Yale, so I want everyone to do well, right? Because when I was growing up, it was like they were all so good, and it was fun to do and all that. So that's just the nature of it. Now, my son is diehard FSU, but in spite, I want the state to do well. I want our schools to do well. But I am not going to make a prediction that I will not stand by. And so I predicted Georgia to beat Florida, and I'm predicting Notre Dame 31, FSU 14 tomorrow night. Not what I want to have happen, just what I think is going to happen. But I will say this, Mason, he'll be wearing his garnet and gold tomorrow. And I told him because, we went to the Miami game down in Miami, and he insisted on wearing his FSU stuff. And I said, buddy, it's going to be all orange and green and all this. And these guys, they're doing the U. And he was not happy to see that hostile environment. So I would just say any Notre Dame fans out there, if you see a little first grader with his FSU regalia, just cut him a little bit of slack. It's his first time on the road in South Bend.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much. Governor, thank you so much.
All right. Come on up here, dude. Wave to everybody. Wave.